Aachen, October 1944. A German Hauptmann is backing through a doorway into a room that no longer has a rear exit. The building has collapsed behind him. His battalion is somewhere to the north, unreachable. His radio operator is dead in the corridor. He still has his Walther P38, 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Enough for what he trained for. The problem is, what he trained for and what's coming through that doorway are not the same thing. An American corporal steps into the frame. Distance, 4 feet. He's carrying an M1 Garand, too long for the room, barrel already catching on the doorpost. He drops it. His right hand crosses his body, finds the M1911 on his hip, thumb sweeping the safety, and he fires. 1 round, 230 grains. The Hauptmann never draws. The battle for Aachen was still going on outside. In that room, it was already over. The .45 ACP was not the most important American weapon of the Second World War. It was the one that appeared exactly when German officers had already lost control of what was happening around them. The German officer's pistol was never designed to be his primary weapon. That is not a failure. That is doctrine. The Wehrmacht built its officer corps around the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission command. Officers directed, NCOs led. Enlisted soldiers executed. The system worked because it pushed decision-making authority as close to the battlefield as possible without putting the decision-makers in the direct line of fire. A company commander was a thinking instrument, not a fighting one. His death cost more than his rifle. The system was designed to keep him at the distance where he could command. So the Walther P38 that many German officers carried into the Second World War was not optimized for close quarters fighting. It was optimized for credibility. 9mm parabellum, 8 rounds in the magazine, weight under 2 pounds, designed to ride on a hip without being noticed, drawn quickly in an emergency, and lethal at the distances an officer was expected to engage. Which meant short ranges against isolated threats in situations that had already gone wrong at every level above him. The 9mm parabellum was not a bad cartridge. It penetrated efficiently at the ranges German doctrine expected. It was accurate, manageable, and light enough that a long march didn't change the calculation. The round had been adopted in 1908 with the Luger P08, carried forward in the more practical Walther P38 that replaced it. On its own terms, a sound service pistol for the officer who carried it. The problem was what the cartridge was optimized for. 9mm parabellum at 1,200 feet per second was a penetrating round, designed to pass through a threat efficiently at expected engagement distances. At the distances where the American answer was built to operate, something else mattered more. German doctrine was not built on faulty premises. It was built on correct premises about the nature of the war Germany had spent a decade preparing for. Maneuver warfare, combined arms coordination, firepower at range, and the command distance that made all of it function. The pistol a German officer carried told you everything about what that doctrine assumed about where he would be standing when the fighting was worst. It assumed he would never have to use it. That was not arrogance, it was doctrine in the precise sense. Expectations about the war derived from how Germany intended to fight it. The pistol reflected those expectations. Both made perfect sense until the moment they didn't. The American military had already learned that lesson. It paid for it in blood, in a war most Americans had half forgotten by 1941. The Philippines, the early 1900s. American soldiers carrying .38 long Colt revolvers were encountering Moro warriors in close combat, men who absorbed rounds that should have stopped them and kept closing to knife range anyway. The .38 long Colt hit them. They kept coming. Soldiers emptied their revolvers into fighters who refused to stop. And the problem was not marksmanship. The round wasn't failing to hit, it was failing to stop. The Army filed its reports. The problem was stopping power. What a round does in the first fractions of a second when it strikes a man who is already committed to closing distance. The .38 long Colt transferred enough energy to wound, not enough to immediately incapacitate. And when an enemy's goal is to cross the last 4 feet before he dies, wounding is not enough. The Army recalled single-action .45 revolvers from storage as a stopgap and commissioned something permanent. The Thompson-Lagarde tests in 1904 examined what calibers actually stopped men reliably. The results pointed toward heavier, larger diameter rounds, cartridges that transferred energy on impact rather than passing through the target. John Moses Browning's design, adopted as the M1911 in 1911, was the direct product of that research. The problem the M1911 was designed to solve deserves to be stated plainly. Not accuracy, not range, not magazine capacity. The problem was a man who was already too close, already committed, already inside the distance where everything else has failed. America entered the Second World War with a pistol that had been refining its answer to that specific problem for 40 years. Germany entered with a pistol that assumed the problem would be rare. Browning built the M1911 around one question: how do you guarantee that a single round stops a man who is already inside your perimeter? The .45 ACP cartridge Browning developed was 230 grains of lead at roughly 830 feet per second. Not the fastest pistol round. The 9mm Parabellum German officers carried moved at over 1,200 feet per second. But after the Philippines, velocity was no longer the variable the Army cared most about. What the Army believed, based on hard experience, was that a larger, heavier round was more likely to stop a close-range fight immediately than a lighter, faster one. Nothing in ballistics is guaranteed, but the Army had learned what happened when they carried a cartridge that wasn't built for that specific problem, and they had no interest in repeating the lesson. When a German officer is still clearing his Walther from its holster, that distinction is the only one that matters. He built the M1911 frame to match the task. Heavy by pistol standards, nearly 2.5 pounds unloaded. Weight that kept the weapon stable under pressure. A 7-round single-column magazine that kept the grip narrow enough to control. A grip safety that prevented accidental discharge when a man fell or rolled. A thumb safety that swept off in the same motion as the draw, so that raising the pistol and readying it happened in one movement, not two. Nothing in the design was arbitrary. Every decision answered the same question: what does a man need when the fight is already too close for him to get it wrong? The M1911 was not a sidearm in the traditional sense. It was institutional memory cast in steel. It carried forward the lesson from the Philippines that combat, when it collapses faster than doctrine can respond. The doctrine said, when it gets this close, the man with the better pistol wins. And America had spent 40 years making sure that man carried a .45. By the time First Army reached Aachen in early October 1944, the Wehrmacht garrison inside the city had a problem their doctrine had not fully prepared them for. Aachen was not a field engagement. It was a building, a corridor, a staircase in the dark where the angles didn't allow for the coordination that German combined arms doctrine depended on to function. The 30th Infantry Division closed from the north. The 1st Infantry Division drove from the south. Together, they completed the encirclement on October 16th, trapping a garrison ordered by Hitler to hold to the last man. What followed inside that perimeter was warfare at its most compressed. American soldiers cleared buildings floor by floor and room by room. Engineers blasting holes through shared walls rather than exposing men in the corridors, a tactic born entirely from the geometry of the fight. The M1 Garand was a liability in a narrow hallway. Its 24-inch barrel, the same barrel that could put a round on target at 300 meters in open country, became an architectural problem when the next threat was measured in steps, not meters. This is where the M1911 stopped being a sidearm and started to matter in ways it rarely mattered in the open. NCOs and officers working point on room clearance drew their .45s and kept rifles slung. Not because the pistol replaced the artillery and engineers and tank support that were taking Aachen apart, but because in the moment a doorway opened at 4 feet, it was the only weapon with the geometry for the space. One-handed retention while controlling a door. Body-width engagement in a door frame. The situations Browning had designed for, 40 years earlier, in a different country, in a different war, playing out as the physics demanded. German resistance in Aachen came from soldiers and officers who had been trained for a different kind of war. Unit commanders inside the city were making decisions in rubble and smoke, often without radio contact, often without the clear chain of command that Auftragstaktik required to function. An officer cut off from his units is a man in a uniform with a pistol. And the pistol he was carrying had been optimized for a different problem. When Americans came through a doorway at 4 feet, what a German officer had trained to do and what he could actually do in that moment were not the same thing. The Walther P38 that had ridden on his hip through years of campaign, adequate, accurate, reliable, had been designed for a scenario that assumed this moment would not define the war. The city surrendered on October 21st after 12 days of the kind of fighting that made the gap between German and American pistol doctrine measurable. Not theoretical, measurable, in the same way the width of a door frame is measurable. At that distance, doctrine stopped mattering. Physics took over. U.S. accounts of the Aachen fighting describe what urban compression does. Distances that contract to arm's reach, corridors too narrow for rifle geometry, and a close-in fight that arrives regardless of what either side planned. The Americans had an answer built into doctrine before the war began. 40 years before anyone knew the question would be asked in a German city. The difference between the two pistols wasn't technology. Germany had the engineering capacity to produce a large-caliber service weapon at any point in the war. They didn't. Because the need for one didn't fit the doctrine that shaped everything else. The doctrine said officers would not be in that room. So the pistol designed for that room was never built. German officers understood, after enough of these engagements, what the problem was. It was not that the 45 ACP was a superior weapon in any absolute sense. It was that the Americans were willing to fight in scenarios that German doctrine had assumed would not become the character of the war. The Western Front's urban engagements, Aachen, the grinding through Normandy's villages, the Rhine crossings, the clearing operations through the German interior at the war's end, produced a consistent pattern. When the fighting compressed into rooms and corridors, German officers lost their ability to command, before American soldiers lost their willingness to close. Not because US soldiers were braver, because German officers were being asked to fight in ways their weapons and training hadn't prepared them for. They had been trained to command. They found themselves required to kill at 4 feet. The Walther P38 was a proven service pistol. In the hands of an officer clearing a room, it was not built for the fight it had found. The cartridge it fired had been designed for one set of assumptions. The war it encountered operated on a different set entirely. What the German officer's pistol told you about German doctrine is what made this structural rather than tactical. That sidearm encoded a claim about the war. German officers would rarely need to fight at close range. Correct until the Western Front compressed into cities and corridors and rooms too small for doctrine to function. When that changed, the pistol and the training arrived at the same moment, and neither was built for what they found. The Americans never made that assumption. They had learned in the Philippines that a man who commits to closing distance is the most dangerous variable on a battlefield. The M1911 carried that lesson forward, worn on the hip of every American officer who pushed through a door in Europe. The M1911 served the United States military until 1985. Over 70 years across 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam, and operations that never appeared in public record. It was replaced by the Beretta M9, chambered in 9mm, the same cartridge German officers had carried into the war. Interoperability with NATO allies drove the change. The argument was made that the assumptions behind the 45 ACP no longer held. Certain units objected. Special operations personnel who worked the close environments where pistol doctrine actually mattered kept the 45. Not out of sentiment, out of the same reasoning that had produced it in 1911. The close quarters problem had not changed. The answer to it had not improved. The 45 ACP was not the weapon that won the Second World War. It was the weapon that encoded a specific lesson about what war looks like when it collapses to its most human dimension. 2 men, a door frame's worth of distance, and no doctrine sophisticated enough to protect either of them. Germany built their officer's pistol for the war they expected. America built theirs for the war that always arrives. That is not a small distinction. It is the difference between an officer who draws his weapon and finds it was designed for a different fight, and an officer who draws his and finds it was designed for exactly this one. The men who carried the M1911 didn't win because they were braver. They won because the men who designed their weapon never assumed they'd be safe enough not to need it. If that distinction matters to you, this channel exists for exactly that conversation.